28th of July in the county of Somerset, England. A man named Peter Williamson was having a barbecue in the garden. It was a pleasantly sunny day, but at some point the weather changed dramatically. The atmosphere became charged as if a storm were brewing, and the Williamsons' dog ran to cower beneath the tree, seemingly spooked by the strange atmosphere. Upon seeing his pet so frightened, Peter decided to go and rescue the animal and bring it back indoors. But as he walked towards the tree, there was a huge flash, and Peter literally vanished into thin air. The police were called, and Mary, Peter's wife, had seemingly witnessed what had happened as she had to be sedated. The Williamsons' children were sent away to stay with friends, and despite a massive search, there was no sign at all of Peter. The theory was put forward that a lightning strike nearby had disorientated the guests, causing them to miss what had happened, and perhaps Peter had amnesia, so he had wandered off. Then, 3 days later at 8 o'clock in the morning, Peter was found unconscious in nearby shrubbery, with 1 foot in the pond of a locked garden. It was as if he'd been dropped there out of nowhere, as there was no sign as to how he'd got in. Peter spent several days in hospital suffering from shock, with no memory of what had happened. Then the dreams started, and as time went on, Peter began to suspect they were more than just his imagination. In the dreams, he found himself standing in an unfamiliar garden, soaking wet. Dazed and confused, he began to wander the roads until he was taken to a hospital. He spent time undergoing tests, and he could remember the name of the ward he was on, a doctor, a sister, and various nurses. The dreams were long and mundane, one of the reasons he began to suspect that they were in fact real. One of the more peculiar things Peter remembered was that from time to time the hospital shimmered around him, as if in a sort of haze. Furniture would appear where before there had been none. Then the ward would return to normal. He also remembered that when talking, his own voice sounded very strange, as if he was speaking in slow motion. As his condition started to improve, Peter was allowed to go for a walk around the grounds of the hospital, a hospital he did not recognise. As he started to wander down a lane outside, he began to get a sense of familiarity. This was the last thing he could remember before being found in the garden. A researcher named Colin Parsons stayed with the family for 3 days. The hospital was traced. It was a nearby cottage infirmary, and it did indeed have a ward with the same name, doctor and sister, as Peter had remembered. But the doctor didn't recognise Peter, and hospital records showed that he'd never stayed there. It was surmised that Peter must have invented the dream from information in his subconscious, perhaps a conversation he'd once had about the hospital. This seems a little far-fetched, and it doesn't explain what happened to him. This was a man who literally vanished in front of several eyewitnesses, a man who had no recollection of where he'd been for 3 days, and who was able to accurately give the names of a ward, doctors and nurses, a place he'd never been and people he had never met. Perhaps a better explanation is that Peter had somehow slipped into a parallel dimension, one in which things were a little bit different to his own reality. His voice sounded strange because he was out of sync. He didn't belong in that world. There are many stories of people who've experienced time jumps who return feeling nauseous or in a kind of catatonic state. The shimmering of the hospital sounds as if it looked strange to him because he wasn't properly anchored in that reality. Of course, if there are parallel worlds, then it's quite possible there were lots of Peters who were snatched into an alternate universe that day. Different Peters who also couldn't quite work out what had happened to them, leaving the chilling thought that perhaps the Peter that returned to our world wasn't the same Peter that left.